I found a secret alternate version of the Parish. No, this isn't clickbait. You yourself can find and play this chapter. You don't need to mess with any files or download any mods. This hidden chapter solves a ton of mysteries, creates a bunch of them too, and is jam-packed with a bunch of interesting details. How did I find this map? Why does it exist? What's in it? All questions I'll get into. So let's just jump straight into what? No, not him. Not him.
Subscribe to Cookie Blitz right now. It's completely free and helps out his channel, or so I'm told. And while you're at it, like the video. 1,000 likes equals bunny pics on his community tab. Y'all know the deal. Do it if you want to see the rest of the video. You done? You subscribed yet? Alright, here he is.
Ah, Jesus Christ. Thank y'all for subscribing. That wasn't very pleasant. You did subscribe, right? Alright, jokes aside, let's jump straight into the video. Now, to understand how I discovered this hidden map in the first place, we have to go back a couple of months ago and look at my Unsolved Mystery series. You see, while doing those videos, in order to explore the map and get footage, I have to load into the Valve campaigns using console commands. Because of this, you don't really find this hidden map in the traditional way by exploring the finished versions, which is probably why a lot of people don't know of its existence. And whenever I'd load up any chapter of the Parish, I noticed an extra map, and for weeks I never loaded it up, until one fateful day. Loading into the map was as easy as accessing the console and typing out the word map followed by C5M1_, and instead of clicking waterfront, click on the word waterfront_Essenscape. Based on what I saw people saying on Reddit, it actually stands for soundscape. The first thing I noticed upon loading into the map was the loading screen. Instead of the Parish's poster, it uses the default poster, which is understandable as it isn't a finished map. After spawning in, there are some initial blaring differences. The first thing is the lighting. It's not set up properly and everything looks like it has this white coat over it. The sky is pitch black, which is a nice touch, and you don't spawn on the dock like you do in the original. Rather, you spawn ever so slightly into the level. I can't help but wonder if this was going to be the original spawn point or if this was just for testing purposes. If you head over to where the dock is, you can find the starter loot, so it's fair to say they intended for you to access this area at the very least. There's a few other differences in this area. The house texture above is missing, which you'll find is a commonality all throughout this campaign. The ramp doesn't exist and is instead replaced by these planks that lead to this very rudimentary steep staircase. Heading back on top, there's a few tables that aren't in the finished version. If you look on top of the tables, there are a bunch of these blue containers that were meant for people to put their shoes in. Sita most likely did this to stop people from tracking the disease across certain areas. These blue containers also don't exist in the finished version and give some good foreshadowing on Sita's operations that you'll see later in the level. Unfortunately, since this wasn't included in the final product, some of that world building is lost. The dead bodies behind this nearby fence are the Left 4 Dead 1 versions and not the second games, which lead me to believe that this version of the Parish was created very early on in development. I can't believe I didn't mention this already, but you can find a gnome on one of the tables next to the dock. I have no idea why this exists or why he's placed in this specific spot, but it's cool, so we'll let it slide. Heading into the next area, there aren't any major differences between this version and the actual map, but one difference I did notice was the color of this car. It can sometimes spawn as this really bright blue color. I wish they would have kept this in. The dead bodies in the area are once again the old Left 4 Dead 1 low resolution versions. As you walk forward, if you choose to walk up the fallen balcony, you'll notice that the upstairs room that usually has weapon spawns no longer has any. If you head a bit down the road, the evacuation bus texture is the one from Death Toll. This design was probably just used as a placeholder, or they just decided to change it later on. The bar next to the bus looks like they had the procedural generation planned and implemented in some way, but from what I can tell, it doesn't actually work. Every time I've loaded up the map, this area always has a door instead of the possibility of a wall spawning like in the finished version. The long walkway that goes past the side of the bar is still here and arguably looks identical besides a few small details. The stairs at the end of the walkway are here as well. If we walk into the backyard area, it's not as detailed as the other version, but something I did notice was the spacing. It looks like this fence part was pushed closer to the kitchen. I might be wrong, wrong. It might be the buildings that were changed, but at a first glance, that's what I'd assume. Turning our attention to the restaurant/kitchen area, not much has changed, but you can find this little counter area that didn't end up making the final cut. I've always thought this window area was a little weird, that there was no intermediary for the waiters to use, either to stand behind or put plates on. With its inclusion, this serving window looks a lot more practical. If we go outside, this is where you'll notice some pretty major differences. This version of the waterfront contains the first and second maps in their entirety. The safe room that's usually inside the small convenience store doesn't exist, and neither is the huge fence that blocks off the street. The car placement along the road is completely different. There's a news truck that's not here in the other version, and the interior of the store is a bit different. For starters, there's a lot more trash. There's also these two machines that aren't normally here, and two shelves in the back that are in the finished version aren't here in the alternate version. And if you turn up your volume, you can hear this really eerie soundtrack. It sounds like humming of ceiling lights, but only plays in this room. It's kinda creepy. It kinda reminds me of the back rooms. Heading back outside, you can find this makeshift living area. There's some bedrolls and this tarp that's nailed into some nearby concrete, implying that this area must have been lived in, at least for a little while after the city fell. It's obviously not in the finished version, and I wonder why they took it out. Maybe they wanted the map to feel like it was abandoned more recently, rather than feeling like our survivors arrive way after everything happens. Remember this little detail because we'll find something very similar in just a second. The tan military Humvee that you can find at the end of the road is instead replaced by an ambulance, which was very interesting the first time I found out. I personally feel like the ambulance fits better here, but the Humvee really implies military presence, which is kind of the theme of this campaign. The stairs that lead up to the park remain relatively unchanged. The little underpass next to the stairs exists in this version, however it doesn't have any loot spawns. The entirety of the park remains almost the same. The only big difference is this campsite. In the final product it doesn't exist, but in this version there's 4 sleeping bags, a campfire, and even an item spawn. Remember the other living area I showed you not too long ago? It's odd that a lot of the things that have been removed involve some sort of camp. Again, maybe Valve felt these campsites made the map feel too abandoned, causing them to remove it, but we'll never know for sure. Before you head down the alleyway, usually the player can find a blue Ceta tent that spawns with 2 medkits, but in this version it's not here. Instead it's replaced by a pile of luggage. If you didn't know, the people of this area were heading towards the military evacuation outpost, which is why they would have had a lot of their belongings. In the finished version, this wall has some sort of spray paint that says, "Where is Ceta?" along with a few quarantine posters. However, in this version, there's a military poster sign, similar to the ones we see in Blood Harvest. The next area has some huge differences. For starters, a lot of the highway assets don't exist. The road above and some of the pillars either don't exist or have been slightly moved. The loot that you can typically find in this area has been heavily toned down. Instead of getting some tier 2 guns, melees, and tier 1 spawns, you get some ammo and a pistol. There's a line of orange fencing that doesn't exist in the actual version, and there's a lot more dead bodies here. Personally, the older version of these dead bodies look a lot more gruesome. In the finished version of the Parish, there's this tower that overlooks the area where people would have been waiting. However, in this alternate version, there's an operable machine gun and ladder that allows the player access up here. I don't know why they removed this. I love it for 2 reasons. First off, it accurately depicts how the people in this area died. Obviously, the military opened fire with this gun, killing everyone. Of course, we knew this already, but it's nice to know exactly how it went down. The second reason is for gameplay. It's just fun to go up here and shoot all the zombies down below. I bet it'd be super fun. The following area has some of the biggest changes lore-wise. Instead of the Ceta van, there's just a room here. There's still some healing items that spawn inside, but instead of just opening the door, you're meant to open this door using a control panel, which would sound the alarm instead. You might have noticed these circular devices on the ceiling. These devices are called decontamination nozzles. They have many names, but their use is to decontaminate, hence the name. In this case, it's whoever's standing inside the room. Unfortunately, these specific ones don't actually function in-game, and neither does the control panel. Funnily enough, the alarm sequence works on this map. If you use no-clip to go through the door, it'll sound off the alarm like usual. The survivors still need to head towards the tower in the middle to shut it off, but before we do that, if we head to the opposite side of the evacuation site, we can find some more of these towers we saw earlier. Jumping back to the tower in the middle, if you shut off the alarm, something interesting happens. But to understand why what we're talking about is so cool, we have to go over how it usually works. You see, in the final version, if you turn off this alarm, you You just have to wait a little bit until this door opens, which will allow you to go through, which still happens in the alternate version. However, the biggest difference is the decontamination nozzles. Unlike the previous time we saw them, these actually work. If you head into this room right after turning off the alarm, you can spot them shooting out what I can only assume is some type of disinfectant. This properly explains why there's two doors that remain closed, wait a little bit, and then open. That part made it into the finished version, but for some reason the nozzles didn't. This detail adds so much clarity. Sita was actually disinfecting people before evacuating them, that they weren't just shoving them onto buses after handing out wristbands. There's only a couple more noticeable differences. The evacuation buses used here are still the death toll versions and not the ones we ended up with. The spacing around the back of the building is a bit tighter. In the final product, it's slightly more spacious, allowing for a bit more wiggle room. If we jump backwards in the map slightly, above the overpass you can find this house. I don't know why this is here, it's not in the finished version, and I'm pretty sure the highway would go right through it. So once again, why is this here? The final difference is the ending safe room. In the soundscape version, it's pushed off to the right of the wall, but in the finished version, it's straight in front of you as you walk out behind the building. There's also a couple differences inside. The wall textures are different. A strip of bright yellow runs along the bottom quarter of the wall. There's no dead bodies inside the safe room, which is a very important detail. There's no table. Instead, the weapons and items just spawn on the floor. The guns in this version of the safe room suck. They're only tier 1 and not tier 2. Oddly enough, in the corner of the room sits a generator surrounded by 3 cones, but in the other version, the 3 cones are still there, but the generator disappeared. My boy just didn't make the cut. So now that I've gone over basically every detail, I want to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. I provided some short explanations for some of the more important details, but let's stitch them all together. When our survivors first arrive, I think it was always planned for them to be dropped off by Virgil, or at the very least some type of boat. Because in both versions, the dog is very clearly at the start. Sita in both versions would have been meeting anyone who came off the docks, hinted at by the Sita tents at the start of the level. However, as we talked about, some of the tables and shoe containers were eventually removed from the final version. Not only do I think they should have stayed in the final release, but those details really hint towards Sita's overwhelming presence later in the campaign. Sure, like I said, some of these details like a tent or two exist normally, but without this alternate version, I never really realized what they were trying to imply here. Fast forwarding a bit to the halfway point of the level, it's very clear that the first and second maps were originally supposed to be one long map. Now this brings up another interesting question. Why did they decide to cut this map in half? Did they just make the two connected to add consistency, or did they realize the map was too long? I'd probably go with the second one, because if they made the two together just for consistency, details like the roadblock in the front of the safe room would still be there. There's the other fact that the safe room in the area just doesn't exist and is replaced by an optional loot room. There's some other smaller details like the news truck and the ambulance that were either removed or swapped out. The news truck is the one detail I wish they kept. You can find this same asset in Death Toll, and its inclusion really emphasizes the transaction of information. We know that not all the details about the infection are completely understood to the majority of people, so littering the streets of infected areas with news vans really shows how much the press is trying to investigate and understand the situation. I went over this slightly, but Valve's choice to remove the ambulance and replace it with the Humvee is an interesting one. I think the main reason they did it was to imply the military has been getting involved. It's the whole theme of the Parish, to be honest, but starting off the level purely with Sita assets and objects reflects how they started off with control initially. Then that mantle of control slowly transitioned over to the military, which is given to the audience in small snippets like this Humvee, before fully transitioning all the way at the end of the actual campaign. Before we leave the area, it's important to point out a few of the campsites. My explanation I used earlier was that Valve didn't want the campaign to feel like it had been abandoned for a long amount of time, and I still believe that. However, there's some campsites that still exist, like the campfire under the overpass and the bedrolls you can find on the hill next to it. Maybe they weren't included to make the map feel abandoned. Maybe they were included to emphasize how long and how many people were waiting in line to be evacuated. In the finished version, I never assumed that the campsites you find right outside the Sita Center were made after the city fell. Instead, they were put up because people had been waiting for days to be put on one of the buses. If we go with this assumption, then the amount of people waiting in line must have been insane, because if the line stretched all the way down to the park, then there must have been hundreds or thousands thousands of people all packed into this one area. This detail also provides more insight on why the military started killing people in front of the evacuation center. It's possible that someone must have become infected, or an infected must have found its way into the area, causing the military to not take any chances and open fire on the crowd, using the 50 cal we saw earlier. Speaking of the seed evacuation center, the buildings in the alternate version are better in my opinion. At least the second room is. I like the Ceta van in the beginning of the real level, but I have no idea why they got rid of the decontamination nozzles in the second room. It hints at a clear procedure, and even in the final version you can tell the entire area was made with this process in mind. Even the mist effect was in the alternate version. I don't see why they couldn't have just left it in. All in all, the differences between this and the final version are incredible. They give us further insight on how the map was originally laid out, and clue us in on some lore that was unfortunately scoped out in production. I want to make this clear, I don't claim to be the first person to have found this, but while trying to look up stuff for this video, the only things I could find online were a few Reddit posts and a couple of replies, so I thought I'd make a video about it and bring it to light. Did you know this existed? What amazed you? Did you learn anything from this video? Please let me know down in the comment section below, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace out.